It was a dark and stormy night, and members of the rubber band were stretched around the campfire. And one of them said, "Captain, tell us a story." So this is the story that the captain told. It was many, many years ago, and Mr. and Mrs. Snow were riding a great big ocean liner between New York and London. And one night it was very stormy, and the lightning flashed, and the thunder roared, but the seas were running high, and the ship was tossing. And Mrs. Snow was not feeling too well, and she said to Mr. Snow, "I think I'll go out and walk around the deck a bit." And Mr. Snow said, "All right, dear, you go out and walk, and I'll be out shortly." Well, Mrs. Snow went out onto the back of the boat, on the stern, stood by the rail, and a little while later her husband joined her. And she was feeling much better now. And she said, "I have been out here for quite a while. Do you mind if I go in?" And Mr. Snow said, "Well, all right, dear, but I think that I will stand here for a few moments longer." And so Mrs. Snow went into the ship, went down the passageway, and all of a sudden she heard a scream. The wind howled, the thunder roared, but she was sure that it was her husband's voice. So she rushed back out to the passageway, across the deck, back to the stern, and the rail. There wasn't a soul there. Far in the distance, in the storm above the sea, she heard this call again. "Help me! Help me!" The wind blew, the thunder roared. She rushed up to the bridge deck and called to the captain and said, "Captain, my husband has fallen overboard." Well, immediately many things happened. They turned on the searchlights, and the ship turned about, and all the seamen and everything went to the sides of the ship, and they looked down into the water. There was nobody floating there at all. Well, they went round and round searching for Mr. Snow, but they could never find Mr. Snow. So the captain finally said, "Well, Mrs. Snow, we cannot stay here any longer. We've got to go on our trip on to London." So the ship sailed on, and they arrived in London, and Mrs. Snow booked passage on the return trip back to New York. And when they got to about the spot where Mr. Snow had fallen over, she stood at the rail by the stern, same place he had fallen over, and she called, "Mr. Snow! Mr. Snow!" The wind caught her voice, just carried it away. But then, in the night, she heard this word, or these words. "It floats, it floats, it floats." She rushed up to the captain and she said, "My husband fell overboard on the last trip 10 days ago, and I heard his voice. I heard his voice. He called to me." So the captain turned the ship about. All the seamen went to the side. They turned on the searchlights, but they could find no one in the sea. Well, she was sure that it had been Mr. Snow that had called to her. And so she booked passage. Once they arrived in New York, she booked passage on the next ship that was going back to London. Oh, this was costing her so much money. But sure enough, they were 4 days out at sea, and she was on the stern, by the rail, the same place that he had fallen over before. The wind was howling this night, and she called, "Mr. Snow! Mr. Snow!" Her voice was lost in the wind. Suddenly she heard above the howling wind, "It flows, it flows, it flows." She was sure that it was Mr. Snow's voice. So again she ran to the captain, and she said, "Captain, I know it's my husband's voice. Turn the ship around. Search the seas." Oh, the captain turned the ship about, and all the sailors went to the rail, and they turned on the searchlights, but their search was for no avail, and they arrived back in London. Now this was the third trip, and Mrs. Snow was bound and determined, and with her last few remaining dollars, she booked passage on the next ship going across the Atlantic. And 4 days out, she stood back on the rail. Oh, and this was a dark and stormy night. Oh, this was a wild night. The seas were running high, and the rain was coming down, and the lightning flashed across the heavens, and the thunder roared. And Mrs. Snow stood there on the stern of the ship, and she called out into the wind, "Mr. Snow! Mr. Snow!" Her voice was lost in the wind, and then she heard it again. It floats, oh, it floats. She was sure that it was her husband, and she called out again, "Oh, husband dear, what floats?" "Irish love floats!"